I smiled, nodded once, and signed every paper my son-in-law put in front of me. He thought he'd won. 3 weeks earlier, I was lying in a hospital bed in Mercy General with a fractured wrist, 2 bruised ribs, and a nurse's station that smelled like burnt coffee and floor cleaner. A car had clipped me in the parking lot of the hardware store on Route 9. Nothing life-threatening, the doctor said, but at 67 your body reminds you it doesn't bounce back the way it used to. I was supposed to stay 2 nights for observation. I stayed 4. My daughter, Penny, came the first evening. She sat beside the bed and held my good hand and cried a little, which I appreciated, even if it made me uncomfortable the way it always does. I've never known what to do when someone cries for me. I usually just pat their hand and say something useless, like, "I'm all right." Her husband, Bryce, came the second day. He didn't sit down. He stood near the door with his arms crossed, like he had somewhere better to be, and asked me 3 times in 10 minutes whether I'd thought about what happens if things get worse. That was his phrase. What happens if things get worse? He said it the way a man says something he's been rehearsing. I told him I'd be fine, he said. Well, sure, hopefully, but you live alone in that house, and Penny worries. He paused. We both worry. I looked at him for a long moment. Bryce is 41 years old. He has the kind of face that looks trustworthy until you've known him long enough to notice he only smiles when someone else is losing something. I've known him 11 years. I noticed it around year 3. I appreciate that, I said. He nodded and checked his phone. What Bryce didn't know, what he'd never bothered to find out, because men like Bryce assume they already know everything worth knowing about a retired shop teacher from Doylestown, Pennsylvania, was that I'd been preparing for that conversation for almost 2 years. Let me back up. My wife, June, passed in the spring of 2019. Pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end, which the doctor said was unusually fast and which I have never found a useful way to think about. We were married 39 years. She was the one who kept the files, paid the bills on time, remembered birthdays. After she died, I had to learn to do all of it myself, and in doing that, I found things I hadn't known were there. June had been careful, quietly, methodically careful, the way she was about everything. We owned our house outright, a 4-bedroom colonial on Addison Street that her parents had helped us buy in 1987. Over the years, she'd also quietly accumulated 3 rental properties in Bucks County, all held in a family trust she'd set up with her attorney. A woman named Patricia who had an office above the dry cleaner on Main and who June had trusted completely. The trust named me as the primary beneficiary and trustee. Penny was listed as secondary. I didn't fully understand what that meant until I sat down with Patricia after the funeral, and she walked me through it slowly, the way you explain something to someone who is grieving, and can only hold about 30% of what you're saying. What it meant in plain terms was this. The house on Addison Street and the 3 rental properties were protected. They could not be sold, transferred, or encumbered without my authorization as trustee. Any document attempting to change that would have to go through Patricia's office and would be flagged automatically. June had built a wall around everything we owned, and she'd done it without ever making a production of it. I used to tease her that she was the practical one in our marriage. I didn't know the half of it. After I understood what we had, I called Patricia, and we spent an afternoon updating everything. We tightened the language in the trust. We added a provision that any power of attorney I signed would be automatically limited in scope and would not extend to real property or financial accounts without a second notarized confirmation from me in person at Patricia's office. We documented my mental competency with a formal evaluation from my physician, Dr. Anand, on file and dated. Patricia asked me why I wanted all of this. I told her I had a feeling. She didn't ask me to explain further. She just wrote it all down. So when Bryce showed up at Mercy General with his arms crossed and his rehearsed concern about what happens if things get worse, I already had a wall around everything he'd come to look at. He just didn't know it yet. I came home from the hospital on a Thursday. My wrist was in a soft brace and my ribs ached when I breathed too deep, but I could manage. Penny came over the first weekend and brought food, which was genuinely kind of her. She reorganized my kitchen cabinets without asking, which is a habit of hers that used to bother me more than it does now. Bryce came with her. He toured the house with his hands in his pockets the way a man tours a property he's thinking about buying. He commented that the gutters needed cleaning. He asked about the furnace. He stood in the doorway of my home office for a long moment, looking at the filing cabinet in the corner, and I watched him from the hallway and said nothing. Over the next 2 weeks, Penny called me every day. The calls were loving, and I believe her concern was real, but woven into each call, like a thread you don't notice until you pull it, were small questions. Was I managing the bills okay? Had I thought about simplifying things? Had I considered that it might make sense, just for peace of mind, to put Penny on the accounts, or maybe give Bryce power of attorney so that if something happened, they could handle things quickly? Each time I said I'd think about it. What I was actually thinking about was my father. My father was a carpenter. He built furniture and kitchen cabinets in his shop behind our house in Allentown for 40 years. He was not a complicated man, but he taught me one thing I have never forgotten. He said, when someone keeps asking you for something they don't need, they need it for a reason they're not telling you. He said a man's first offer of help and his fifth offer of help and his fifth offer of help are 2 different things. Pay attention to which number you're on. Bryce, by my count, was on offer number 7. On a Sunday afternoon in late October, they came over together. Penny made coffee. Bryce sat across from me at the kitchen table and opened a folder. He'd had documents prepared. A durable power of attorney. A healthcare proxy. A deed transfer for the house on Addison Street, moving it from the trust into joint tenancy with Penny. He explained each one in the patient, slightly too loud voice people use when they assume you're confused. He said it was just practical. He said it was what any financial advisor would recommend. He said June would have wanted Penny protected. He said June's name to get me to sign. I picked up each document. I read them slowly. Bryce's knee bounced under the table. Penny stared at her coffee. I signed all 3. Bryce exhaled and leaned back in his chair. He smiled. That particular smile of his, the one I've been watching for 11 years. He stacked the papers and put them back in his folder. He said we'd all feel better now. I said I was sure we would. What he had in that folder were copies. 3 weeks before, while Penny and Bryce thought I was simply recovering and getting my affairs in order, I had driven to Patricia's office and had a long conversation. Patricia had prepared what she called mirror documents, forms that looked, to a non-lawyer, identical to standard power of attorney and deed transfer paperwork. They had the right headers, the right language, the right signature lines. But they weren't filed anywhere. They were legal nullities. The trust deed for Addison Street remained exactly as it was. My accounts were unchanged. Patricia held the originals. I signed Bryce's papers with my own name, in my own handwriting, exactly as he'd asked, and every stroke of that pen was completely meaningless. I didn't tell Penny. That part still costs me something when I think about it. She is my daughter, and I believe she loves me, but she had handed me to him piece by piece in 11 years of small decisions, choosing his moods over my dignity at Thanksgiving, going quiet when he spoke over me, bringing me documents to sign at a kitchen table like I was a transaction to complete. I don't know how much she knew about what he was doing. I'm still not sure I want to know. What happened next moved faster than I expected. Bryce, apparently convinced he now held power of attorney over my assets, approached a real estate attorney in Philadelphia about liquidating one of the rental properties in Warminster. He presented the documents. The attorney ran the standard title search. The title search returned a flag. All 3 rental properties and the house on Addison Street were held in the June and Walter Marsh Family Trust. Any transfer required authorization from the trustee, me, confirmed in person at the office of the named trust attorney. The power of attorney Bryce held did not satisfy that requirement. The documents he'd had me sign contained a clause, buried in paragraph 9, in standard legal language he'd clearly never read, specifying that the POA explicitly excluded real property held in trust. Patricia had put that clause in herself. She'd been putting it in documents for 30 years. She said most people trying to take something from an elderly client never read past the signature line. Bryce's attorney called Patricia's office to clarify the discrepancy. Patricia clarified it very thoroughly. I don't know exactly what was said in that phone call. Patricia has a professional obligation to be measured and precise, but she told me afterward, in her dry way, that the other attorney had a number of follow-up questions and had gone quiet for a period that she described as longer than usual. The following Tuesday, there was a knock at my front door. I was in the kitchen drinking coffee and watching the birds at the feeder June had put up in the backyard in 2014, which I've kept stocked every winter since. I set down my mug and walked to the door. Two men. One in a sports coat, one in a uniform. The one in the sports coat showed me a badge and identified himself as a detective with the Bucks County District Attorney's Financial Crimes Unit. They were not there for me. Bryce had, in attempting to use the fraudulent POA at the real estate attorney's office, crossed a line that Pennsylvania takes seriously, presenting a document to an attorney for the purpose of initiating a property transfer, while knowing or having reason to know that document did not convey the authority it represented. That is not a civil matter. That is a criminal one. There is a specific statute in Pennsylvania for financial exploitation of an older adult. Patricia had already been in contact with the DA's office for several days. I answered their questions. I showed them the originals, safely in Patricia's care. I showed them the documentation of my mental competency evaluation dated 8 months prior. I showed them everything, in order, the way my wife taught me to keep things. Clearly labeled, easy to find, nothing missing. Penny called me that evening. She was crying in a way that was different from the hospital. Not soft and worried, but jagged, broken open. She said she hadn't known. She said she thought it was just paperwork. She said Bryce had told her it was what everyone does, that it was normal, that I would never notice or care about the details. I listened. I let her say all of it. Then I said, "I know you didn't start it, Penny, but you handed him the pen." She went quiet. I told her I loved her and that I wasn't going anywhere. I told her the house on Addison Street would always be in the family, exactly the way her mother intended. I told her that when she was ready to have a real conversation, I would be here. She came over the following Saturday without Bryce. We sat on the back porch for 3 hours. We didn't talk about the legal situation. There were attorneys handling that, and I had been advised to let them. We talked about June. We looked at the bird feeder. We ate the peanut butter cookies she'd brought because she remembered they were my favorite, which I hadn't thought she'd remembered. I didn't forgive everything that afternoon. I want to be honest about that. Forgiveness isn't a switch you flip on a Saturday in November, but something opened a little, enough to let air in, and that was enough for the day. Bryce was charged in the spring. The charge was financial exploitation of a protected adult under Pennsylvania's Older Adults Protective Services Act, along with a secondary charge related to presenting a materially misleading document for a property transaction. His attorney negotiated. I was asked whether I wanted to make a statement for sentencing. I did. I kept it short. I said that my wife spent a lifetime building something solid so that our family would be taken care of. I said she didn't do that so someone could stand over her husband in a hospital room and start counting what was left. I said I hoped whatever came next gave him time to think about the difference between the things you own and the things you actually earned. I didn't look at him while I read it. There was nothing I needed to see. Patricia called me after the sentencing. She said I'd handled the whole thing with considerable patience. I told her I'd had a good teacher. She asked if I meant June. I said partly June, partly my father, and partly the plain fact that when you spend 40 years teaching shop to teenage boys, you learn to recognize when someone's trying to take something that doesn't belong to them before they've even reached for it. She laughed. It was a good laugh. It's February now. The bird feeder needs refilling every 3 days because the cold makes everything hungrier. I do it in the morning with my coffee, before the neighborhood wakes up, and I watch the sparrows argue over the sunflower seeds, and I think about June. The way I always do in the quiet. The house on Addison Street is exactly where it has always been. Paid for, protected, documented, mine. And one day Penny's, in the way her mother always meant it to be. I don't think much about Bryce. I don't think much about the papers he brought to my kitchen table, or the smile he had when I signed them, or the 3 weeks he spent believing he was smarter than a retired shop teacher with a fractured wrist and a good attorney. Some men see an old man and think, easy. They forget that easy and patient are two very different things, and that the quiet ones have usually been planning longer than anyone knows. I keep thinking about the bird feeder. June put it up in the backyard in the spring of 2014. a cedar one with a green roof, and she filled it herself every morning until she couldn't anymore. After she died, I kept filling it, not because anyone asked me to, not because it meant anything grand, just because it was the right thing to do, and the right things are usually quiet and small and nobody notices you doing them. That's the part of this whole story I keep coming back to. Bryce never noticed me. Not really. He saw a retired shop teacher with a bad hip and a brace on his wrist, a man who lived alone in an old house and probably hadn't thought hard about anything since he stopped grading papers. He made a decision about who I was before he ever sat down across from me, and that decision cost him everything, not because I was clever, because he wasn't paying attention. There's something I've come to believe about the way life settles its accounts, and it has nothing to do with luck or fate or anything you'd find in a church bulletin. It has to do with choices that compound. Every time Bryce chose the shortcut, the easy read of a situation, the assumption that an older man wouldn't notice the fine print, the willingness to use my daughter as a delivery mechanism for his own ambition, he was building something. He just thought he was building toward what he wanted. He was actually building toward a Tuesday morning, when two men knocked on his door, and every time I chose the slower road, the afternoon with Patricia going over trust language, the mental competency evaluation I scheduled on a quiet Wednesday, the years of keeping June's filing system intact because it was the right thing to honor, I was building something too. I didn't know exactly when it would matter. I just knew that careful work has a way of being there when you need it. June taught me that. Not in any single conversation, but in 40 years of watching her do things thoroughly and without fanfare. She didn't talk about integrity. She just filed things correctly and paid attention and never cut a corner because it was convenient. That's a harder kind of character to build than the loud kind. The loud kind announces itself. The quiet kind just holds. What I want people to take from this, if they take anything, is that the sharpest tool I had in all of this wasn't anger and it wasn't money. It was the habit of thinking ahead, of asking myself, even in ordinary times, what would it mean if this went wrong? And then doing the unglamorous work of preparing for that, not once, but consistently, over years, the way my father built a cabinet, joint by joint, nothing left loose. Penny is still learning what her part in all of this cost her. That's her own accounting to do, not mine. I'm not carrying it for her, and I'm not rushing her through it. Some things take the time they take. What I know is that the house on Addison Street is exactly where June left it. The bird feeder needs filling every 3 days in February, and an old man who pays attention and does his paperwork is a much harder target than he looks. Most people never find that out until it's too late to matter.